cominciare. Ok, e si parla in sì, sì,
Damn. Not oh, well.
Okay, good afternoon to all. So we can start again our program, and we start the afternoon session with the first chair, the first speaker of this afternoon, Francesco Baldassari, please.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you very much. So it is my pleasure to introduce Cynthia Dwork. She's a professor of computer science at the Harvard School of Engineering. She's a Radcliffe alumni professor at Radcliffe. She's also affiliated to the faculty, affiliated faculty at the Harvard Law School, and a distinguished Microsoft scientist. So she was educated at Princeton and Cornell. She received her Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Princeton University, where she also received a special award for excellence in independent research, the first woman ever to do so. She received then her master and PhD degrees in computer science at Cornell. After a 2-year postdoctoral appointment at MIT, she joined the IBM Almaden Research Center. And then in 2001, she joined the nascent Silicon Valley campus of Microsoft Research, where she raised a world-class force in theoretical computer science. She has published more than 100 refereed journal and conference papers and holds 2,000 US and foreign patents for methods and systems designed to protect the privacy of communication networks and digital information, to improve search systems and reduce electronic spam. She was awarded the Dijkstra Prize in 2007 in recognition of earlier work on so-called fault-tolerant systems, which are systems allowing a computer to recover from failure. Her contributions to cryptography include the launching of, again, so-called non-malleable cryptography, which studies and remedies the failures of cryptographic protocols to communicate securely. She is a co-inventor of the first public key crypto system based on lattices, the current best bet for cryptographic constructions that will remain secure even against quantum computers. More recently, Dwork guided a successful effort to place privacy-preserving analysis of data on a firm mathematical foundation. In particular, she invented so-called differential privacy, providing guidelines for preserving the privacy of people who may have contributed the data to a data set. With the introduction into the Apple system and into the Google's Chrome browser, this differential privacy is beginning to be deployed on a global scale. Cynthia Dwork is a member of all of the most prestigious scientific societies in the US, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering. She is a fellow of the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and of the American Philosophical Society. Cynthia Dwork was a co-recipient also of the 2016 TCC, which means the Theory of Cryptography Conference, a so-called Test of Time Award, which is awarded some 8 years after the discovery to test the success in the long run. She received the 2017 Gödel Prize, the 2020 Hamming Medal, the 2020 Knuth Prize. Now, finally, on the personal basis, last but not least, she's the daughter of Bernard Morris Dwork, a wonderful personality and one of the most prominent mathematicians of the second half of last century. He was my teacher at Princeton, and then he was, for 6 years, Chiara Fama professor at this university. And I hope for that, we believe for that, Cynthia feels a special attachment to this university. Okay, so Cynthia now will speak. Hi, Cynthia. Hello. She will speak about outcome indistinguishability, scaffolding sets, and pan calibration. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you also, Professors Ancona and Baldassari and the other organizers for inviting me to be with you for today's celebration. I so wish that the circumstances were different and that I could be with you in person. Padova, and especially the university and the math department, have a special place in the hearts of all members of my family. And I'm really, really deeply honored to be invited to celebrate with you. Let me share my screen now for my talk. Okay. Let me know if there's any point where you can't see things. Okay. So in her 1979 clairvoyant article, Barbara Underwood, who is now as two different ways of approaching the task of moving from evidence to facts. And also pointing out that that task presents similar problems, whether the facts to be found are in the past or in the future. Algorithmic predictors are increasingly being used to score individuals, and as Underwood notes, even in 1979, and all the more today, important benefits and burdens are distributed in society on the basis of these predictions, including release from prison, placement in schools, placement in jobs, and the granting of retail credit. And for this reason, there's increasing concern that they be fair. And I said that I would situate my talk in the landscape of fairness research. So the study of the theory of algorithmic fairness was launched in the summer of 2010 at Microsoft's Silicon Valley Research Lab. And we began, of course, with definitions, because without definitions, we literally do not know what we're talking about. And we identified two major flavors of definitions of fairness: group fairness notions and individual fairness notions. And although we hadn't yet seen the Underwood article, these actually echo the distinction between the statistical inference versus individualized clinical predictions that were discussed by Underwood. Now, group fairness guarantees require some relationships among certain statistics of decisions about typically disjoint demographic groups. So, for example, statistical parity for an admission system to university would say that the demographics of the accepted students are the same as the demographics of the population as a whole. In a scoring function, balance for the positive class would say that the average score that is assigned by the system to a positive member of demographic group A would be the same as the average score for a positive member of demographic group B. Okay. So there's a tremendous amount of research dedicated to ensuring various kinds of group fairness notions. But our feeling is that group fairness notions actually fail under scrutiny. So for example, a steakhouse showing advertisements to the vegetarians in group A and the meat eaters in group B still results in a restaurant that caters principally to the members of B. The hiring of minority candidates may reward more assimilated members of the minority that is, that look like the majority, or that dress like the majority, or have hairstyles like the majority. Satisfaction of group fairness requirements is surprisingly difficult to test, and a compelling recent annual review of criminology paper by Neal and Winship argues that standard benchmark and outcomes tests typically produce invalid inference that, in their words, may diverge from reality in either direction, indicating discrimination when it is not present, or alternatively indicating a lack of discrimination when it is in fact present. Very damningly, natural desiderata, sets of 2 or 3 very natural and desirable group fairness conditions, can be provably impossible to satisfy simultaneously, even for the simple case of 2 disjoint groups, A and B, unless the base rates of whatever it is that's being predicted are the same in the 2 groups. And a topic that we will return to again and again during this talk is which groups should be considered for ensuring group fairness, and what of the intersectionality. Okay, So group fairness notions fail under scrutiny. What about individual fairness? Individual fairness says intuitively that people who are similar with respect to a given class should be treated similarly. And this naturally has a strong legal foundations. The idea that similarly situated people should be treated similarly.
We don't hear you. We don't hear you, Cynthia. Cynthia, what? We don't hear Cynthia. What is it? Cosa ha detto? I'm sorry, Cynthia. I'm sorry. We were interrupted. Yes, a minute ago or so.
Okay.
So it was the connection. I don't know.
All right. Well, I'm back now. Let me reshare.
Okay.
So had we?
Yeah.
Hmm.
You were mentioning strong legal foundation.
But I need to stop and never mind, just a sec. I need to stop the presentation and restart it. Okay, so it has a strong legal foundation, and the problem is to determine who is similarly situated to whom, or given a pair of individuals and a particular task, how dissimilar is this pair of individuals for this particular task? And the need for this metric kind of brought this direction of research to a standstill for a number of years. However, starting a couple of years ago, things started to pick up, and people began looking at different ways of taking partial information about the metric, about the dissimilarity information, and leveraging that to get a more complete picture. And this has been a very, very exciting direction of research. There's also what I call the metric conjecture, which says essentially that no matter what it is that we do, eventually, if we have a system that is considered to be fair, then it's possible by interacting with this system to extract from it a metric. And similarly, if you actually have some kind of a fairness oracle that simply pronounces whether a system is fair or unfair, by interacting with that oracle, we can extract a metric. And supportive results of this type were obtained in 2020. Now, in an attempt to bridge this sort of gap between group fairness and individual fairness, two groups of researchers independently came up with what I call the multi-X framework. So in the multi-X framework, the idea is that there is some condition, X, which is a group fairness guarantee. And the multi tells us that we require this guarantee to hold not just between two different groups, but for sort of all pairs or all subsets of groups in some pre-specified arbitrarily intersecting collection C of demographic groups. So I've got a drawing of these demographic groups on the right. And this is where our talk is going to be situated, in the multi-X framework. So, risk prediction. Risk prediction is, of course, ubiquitous. Risk predictors assign numbers between 0 and 1 to individual instances, and these are typically interpreted as probabilities. For example, what is the probability that it will rain tomorrow? Or what is the probability that this individual will repay the loan? What's the probability that this tumor will metastasize under a particular course of treatment? Or what is the probability that this person, this individual Y, will commit a violent crime in the next 2 years? And the problem with this is that it's not clear at all what is the probability, what is the meaning of the term probability of a non-repeatable event. It's not as if we can grant the loan, see whether X repays it, rewind history, grant the loan again, see whether X repays it, and so on, and come up with some kind of frequentist notion of probability. So what is the probability of a non-repeatable event? And this is so important because without having some notion of this, it's not clear what even the best algorithm, the ideal algorithm, should actually be providing. Now, some people don't even believe that non-integer probabilities exist. That is, they think that all probabilities are actually either 0 or 1. There's no non-determinism, and things look random to us simply because we don't have enough information or enough computational power. And this is something that our work cannot resolve, like the fundamental question of whether randomness even exists. Okay, so I call this the defining problem of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is supposed to be supplying us with probabilities, and we don't even know what is the definition of them. Now, in predictive systems, these things which are viewed as probabilities are learned from binary outcomes data. So for example, did certain tumors metastasize or not metastasize under a given course of treatment? So basically, one approach is to estimate probabilities for individuals by looking at frequencies of events of similar people or similar tumors, notably bringing us back to the problem of who is similar to whom. So indeed, perhaps a metric lurks. Now, here's a tumor. And the question is, what is the chance of metastasis under a given course of treatment? And my numbers are totally made up. So we could imagine that one study of tumors with certain gene expression levels, let's say the locations in pink are the locations in the DNA that are studied, considered in the first study, show that maybe 70% of these tumors will metastasize. But a different study, which looks at other locations in the DNA, might come up with a different number, that tumors that look like this one in the blue locations in the DNA have a 40% chance of metastasizing. And so with this kind of information, we really don't know what number to assign to this particular tumor. I highlight this example because it tells us something very important. And that is that the representation of individuals to the studies, to the training algorithm, to the classification algorithm matters. That if we study individuals that are represented by their pink locations in the DNA, we would get one outcome, and blue locations in the DNA, we would get a different outcome. And with this extreme example in mind, it's not surprising that the way in which individuals are represented to computer systems is a vector for the introduction of bias. So let's cue this up as one thing that we can talk about during the Q&A if we need questions. So if we let X be sort of all possible real people, then the algorithms, all the algorithms, whether they are machine learning algorithms or other kinds of algorithms, operate only on a representation of the person. The algorithms only know what they're told about you, and distinct individuals might be mapped to the same representation because the representations lose information. In this talk, however, our representations are assumed to be very, very rich. So even though representations will lose information, we're going to assume that there are no collisions, that there's enough detail that no two people are mapped to the same place in representation space. Now, I like to keep the following model in mind. I like to think about a probability which is going to be assigned by a force called nature to each individual. You don't have to believe in this. You can believe that individuals don't have probabilities and they simply have, essential truths of 0 and 1. I like to think in terms of a probability that might be between 0 and 1. And in my view, this probability is assigned to individual I by nature. And then the truth is a Bernoulli draw from a distribution that has parameter pi star. So if you insist that probabilities are always integers, then pi star is either 0 or 1, and then OI star will equal PI star. But if you like the idea that maybe there's uncertainty, then maybe PI star is 2/3, and then OI star will have 2/3 chance of being a 1 and 1/3 chance of being a 0. All of our results are agnostic on this point, but this is the way I like to think about it. And for the rest of the talk, whenever there's a star, this refers to actually what happens in real life. So this is the actual outcomes. And if you believe that in nature, then this is the probability that nature assigns. So because our representation is rich and we have no collisions, we can think of the probability pi star as attaching to the representation of I in representation space. Let me just pull up a pointer here. Okay, so there is a probability pi star here. We get through the representation, we get to zi, and that probability just kind of comes with it. All right, so we're not the first people to think about probabilities. So what historically has been desired from probabilities in prediction systems? What are probabilities that, so to speak, look right? Statistics has a huge literature on the forecasting problem. And a good example is to think in terms of weather. So every night the forecaster assigns a probability of rain for the next day, say 30% or 50%. And the calibration condition, sort of highlighted by Philip David, says that if we consider if we consider any possible prediction value, say 30%, then if we look at all of the days on which the predictor said 30%, then indeed on 30% of those, it should actually have rained. And the same thing is true for 70% and so on and so forth. So that's calibration. Now, calibration does not imply accuracy. So for example, if I know the annual frequency of rain, I can predict that same identical annual frequency every single day. And indeed, on approximately that fraction of days, it will have rained. So calibration is clearly not sort of sufficient, but it is a forecaster that is not predicted, not calibrated, clearly needs some improving. Okay. And as I said, there's an extensive literature, and I'm not going to go into the details, but this is here for the record. And it's a really exciting, it's an exciting literature. And I'm particularly charmed by this paper of Philip David in 1985, which makes connections to definition of randomness, convergence in the limit of predictions made by any pair of deterministic, computable, and computably calibrated predictors, which suggests a notion of individual probability. On the other hand, there's also a lot of skepticism in the statistics literature. This is they look at infinite sequence, and Shervish complains that this long run criterion can be absolutely meaningless in our lifetime or before the sun grows cold. Now, calibration also makes sense in the batch setting, and this is where our work is situated. So in the batch setting, the goal is, given a collection of instances with Boolean labels saying whether these were positive or negative instances, to come up with a method, a predictor, which we will denote with the tilde. So this is our algorithm, where the goal is to come up with a predictor that takes representations of individuals and assigns a so-called probability or a number between 0 and 1 to them. And again, calibration now makes sense in that if we look at predictions made by not on the training data, but on test data, and we look at all of the instances on which our predictor said the value V, then in fact on a V fraction of those, we should have positive outcomes. So why am I talking to you about calibration? And this is a talk about fairness. Where did calibration come from? Calibration was first introduced as a fairness criterion by Kleinberg, Mullainathan, and Raghavan to essentially eliminate second guessing of the meaning of a score. So if you have two disjoint demographic groups, A and B, and your predictor is calibrated on both of them, then a prediction value of V means the same thing, whether one is in group A or in group B. A prediction value of V means, well, that if we look at all the people for whom we assigned a V, then a V fraction of them have positive outcomes. And this would be true whether one is in group A or in group B. And calibration, or this two disjoint group calibration here, is a stronger condition than calibration on the group as a whole. So here are my co-authors on outcome and distinguishability: Omer Reingold, Guy Rothblum, Michael Kim, and Gal Yona. And you might say, why are there ovals over their faces? And this is to remind you that representations obscure information. So here's the representation of Gal Yona. And let's say that my predictor has assigned 3/5 to everybody in this set. And let's say that these are the actual outcomes. So in fact, 3 out of 5 are positive outcomes. P tilde is predicted for the whole set of authors. But if we look at the two subsets of the authors in sort of fuchsia and in dark purple, then it is calibrated on neither set. P tilde is calibrated on not this set and not this set. Okay. So it is strict. So subgroup calibration is strictly stronger than calibration for the universe as a whole. Now, it's a fairness condition, but in this and in all of the calibration work that we're talking about today, it's not aspirational. The calibration requirements talk only about the real world, the way it is today, not in any way about the ideal world. They don't talk about affirmative action. They don't talk about improving the environment, either literal or figurative, for the disadvantaged. They only talk about the current real world. So this is the second thing to ask me about during the Q&A. So coming back to this multi-X framework, the condition that Hebert, Johnson, Kim, Reingold, and Rothblum proposed in 2017 is that they propose building, and they show how to build predictors that are simultaneously calibrated on large numbers of arbitrarily intersecting large sets. And this is called multi-calibration, multi meaning on all of the sets, and calibration is the condition. Very importantly, the algorithm applies, sort of requires that one name the sets that are going to be in the collection C. So again, this question of who chooses the sets and when are they chosen is very important, and we will keep coming back to it. Okay. Now, getting to the title of the talk, outcome and distinguishability. So outcome and distinguishability is going to be it's going to suggest what it is we want from prediction algorithms. And we draw inspiration from the example of pseudo-randomness in complexity theory. And the key concept that we're going to deploy is the complexity theoretic notion of indistinguishability. So this is a really popular concept. For example, security of a crypto system requires that encryptions of 0 should not be distinguishable from encryptions of 1. But the primary example for us is going to be pseudo-randomness. So in a truly random string, there is absolutely no pattern to the bits, and the next bit is completely unpredictable, even given an entire prefix. Okay. In a pseudo-random sequence, there is no discernible pattern, no efficient prediction method. So pseudo-random sequences are created by pseudo-random generators that stretch a short, truly random seed to create, with no additional randomness, a longer output sequence that looks random. And now you have to say, well, looks random to whom? And it's again like saying, well, which sets? So this is specified typically via complexity classes. So you might say all algorithms that can run on a 1980s HP calculator in less than 24 hours. That's a complexity class. Or all neural networks of 3 hidden layers and width 256. That's a different complexity class. Or all decision trees of height 6. And in cryptography, typically we look at all polynomial time algorithms, although there are many uses for other notions of more restricted notions of pseudo-randomness. And the amazing thing in cryptography or complexity theory is that under certain standard computational assumptions, it is possible to build pseudo-random sequences that actually appear random to all polynomial time algorithms. So now, inspired by this, let's look at individual probabilities and what it means perhaps for them to look right. So just as pseudo-random sequences look random to a given class of algorithms, we're going to seek predictions that look right to a given class of algorithms. And to understand this, we need the notion of a history or a transcript. And for now, you can just think of this as a list of prediction outcome pairs. So prediction 1 and what happened, prediction 2 and what happened, and so on. Okay. And then we also need the notion of a distinguisher. And while this is a fancy sounding word, it's very simple. It's an algorithm that takes as input a history, and it just produces an output of either 0 or 1. We don't know what it's doing inside, but this is the distinguisher behavior. Okay. Now, the work in the statistics literature could be viewed as what we call prediction indistinguishability with respect to nature. So what does that say? We're going to look at 2 kinds of experiments. The experiments on the left will take as input histories in which we have nature's predictions and nature's outcomes. And I'm denoting that up here as P star. The star means it's from nature, and O star, it's what really happened. Okay. So it takes as input histories that are built this way, and it says 0 or 1. So there's some probability with which it's going to say 1 when we choose according to nature's predictions and nature's outcomes. On the right, I have a different experiment. Instead of having nature's predictions, I have the algorithm's predictions, P tilde. But these are paired with what really happened. So again, for a given distinguisher, we can look, what is the probability when we look at experiments of this type that the distinguisher says 1. Now, when these 2 probabilities are far apart, then we say that this particular distinguishing algorithm, D, really does distinguish nature's predictions from the algorithm's predictions, because it says 1 with a very different probability when it sees histories of this type versus histories of this type. On the other hand, when these probabilities are very close, we say that the algorithm has fooled the distinguisher, because the distinguisher can't distinguish whether these are nature's predictions, which are sort of the truth associated with O star, or the algorithm's predictions. Now, we have our predictor that we built, that's P tilde, and we have a distinguisher. Can we actually test whether D distinguishes between predictions made by nature versus predictions made by the algorithm? And the answer is no, of course not, because we never get to see nature's predictions. We don't even know if nature's predictions are restricted to be either 0 or 1, or whether they can be in between 0 and 1. So, we simply can't do this test. And this actually accounts for a one-sidedness of all of the results in the statistics literature, which requires that the algorithm will pass any test that nature always passes. And what that means is that the distinguishers seeing one of these histories always says 1. And so there's like, you don't need to see these. We know what the distinguisher is going to do. Okay, so we're asking for something stronger. And what we are asking for is we call outcome indistinguishability. So this is basically a shift in perspective. This time, we're only going to use the algorithm's predictions for our indistinguishability notion. Before we had nature's predictions versus the algorithm, now just the algorithm's predictions. What we're going to do is we're going to compare now histories of 2 types. Here we have the algorithm's predictions paired with what actually happened in real life, nature's outcomes. And in the experiment on the right this time, we have the algorithm's predictions paired with outcomes drawn from the distribution that the algorithm determined. So O tilde is drawn from a Bernoulli distribution that has probability P tilde of heads. Okay. So now we compare these 2. And this is something that we can do because we have our hands on everything. We have our hands on nature's outcomes. We can create draws from P tilde because we have our hands on P tilde. So now we're holding everything. And in fact, we can design an algorithm that is outcome indistinguishable with respect to a large class of distinguishers D. It's very democratic in that anyone can suggest a distinguisher, and a predictor that has outcome indistinguishability with respect to a larger collection of distinguishers is simply better than one that is OI with respect to a smaller collection. And we can always update a predictor so that it is outcome indistinguishable from P star in the eyes of additional newly presented distinguishers. Okay. So the proposal then is, or summarizing, we view the scoring functions through the lens of indistinguishability, and we suggest requiring that outcomes drawn from the forecaster's predictions should be indistinguishable from outcomes produced by nature. And this is how we note it. We're actually naming the instance. Here's the probability the algorithm assigns to it. Here's what really happened. And on the other side, again, the instance, the prediction, and the outcome drawn according to the world described by the predictor. Now, we like outcome indistinguishability because it captures the spirit of the scientific method. So there's a wonderful video on YouTube of a lecture by Richard Feynman in which he talks about how new laws of physics are developed. First, he says, you guess the law. This is where the physics comes in. Then he says, you compute the consequences. And finally, you compare the computed consequences to your experimental observations. If there's a disagreement between what you predict and what you actually see in your experiments, your law is wrong. In that simple statement, he says, is the key to science. He also points out that if you don't see a disagreement, all it means is that your law is not yet refuted. It might be in the future, so you should compute new consequences that you would expect to see. So we think of our predictors, P tilde, as a scientific theory. It's trying to tell you what you should expect when you look at the world. In particular, imagine, and this is not something that we can actually do, but imagine that the class of distinguishers is the collection of all polynomial-sized circuits, back to the inspiration from pseudo-randomness. In that case, the outcome indistinguishability condition says that the behaviors predicted by the theory cannot feasibly be distinguished from the behaviors of the real world, even when given access to the predictor. In other words, there's no feasible way to falsify such a theory. So this is where we took our inspiration. Now, can you do it? And the answer is, yeah, we can. But we need to talk about it. Having defined outcome indistinguishability and viewing it from the lens of distinguishing, we realize that there are different sort of degrees of power that we can give to the distinguishers, not just their computational power, but also what is the access that they have to the predictor itself, to the algorithm of the predictor itself. So in the simplest, and this gives us a hierarchy of kind of increasing power of, or increasing indistinguishability. So at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have what we call no access outcome indistinguishability. There is no access given to the predictions. We just see instances and outcomes. The next level is the one we've been discussing, where the distinguisher gets the instance, the prediction for this instance, and either OI star, what actually happened, or OI tilde. The next level up is what we call oracle access OI. And here, the distinguisher can come up with arbitrary instances J and say, give me the prediction on J. And finally, at code access, the distinguisher is given arbitrary access to the actual algorithm or the code for the predictor P tilde. And it turns out that the first two levels of the hierarchy are actually, with a little bit of just a slight change in parameters, equivalent to two notions that were studied in the Aber-Johnson et al. Paper that I mentioned earlier. The lowest level is what's called multi-accuracy, and the next level is multi-calibration. But these other levels, these other two levels, are completely new. And we show that you can construct outcome indistinguishable predictors that are, for the first two levels, for every P star, no matter how complicated nature is, and for every collection C of distinguishers, where our distinguishers are of maximum size S, there's always a predictor whose size is bounded by the size of the distinguishers divided by alpha squared. Alpha is a slack parameter that allows us to be a little bit wrong in our calibration condition. Okay. Now, at higher levels of the hierarchy, this is no longer the case. So for every alpha, there's a P star and a set of circuits of size S, so that when we give this stronger oracle access OI, we actually need predictors that are quite a bit larger. S is now exponential in 1 over alpha, instead of having predictors of size S over alpha squared. So that's a big hurdle. And this is under a computational assumption about fine-grained complexity. So what this is telling us is that the higher levels of the hierarchy are indeed more powerful, and more powerful distinguishers are less easily fooled. The take home for this is that, in real life, people are proposing and using these things, say, for determining whether people should be let out on cash bail or not, let out of jail or not. And the corollary that we get from this is that when these systems are being audited for fairness, the auditors and the defense lawyers should at least have the teeth of oracle access for their evaluation. Okay, so last portion, scaffolding sets and pan calibration. So I keep coming back to this point In multi-calibration, we have to talk about which sets are we multi-calibrating with respect to. When we're looking at outcome indistinguishability, we have to say, what are the distinguishers? Let's think about the set version of this problem because it's more obviously grounded in fairness. First of all, determining which sets you should be using is a ubiquitous problem. It shows up in synthetic data generation. You want to do some kind of synthetic data generation, maybe for reasons of privacy, maybe because you are contractually not allowed to keep the data beyond a particular time. So you want to learn a model from the data, and for various reasons, it's then useful to create synthetic data sets. What is it that you want that model or those synthetic data to actually capture? Which properties of the original data set do you need to capture? People don't know how to answer this question. In the fairness setting, there's also, if you think about these sets as being demographic groups, who determines whether a specific demographic group should be included in the collection? And I think that it's really important to point out that it's not necessarily appropriate to assume that it's the responsibility of the members of this particular demographic group to insist that they receive this equal treatment. It takes energy, it takes time, and it also takes recognition of salience. So one has to realize that one is being treated unfairly in order to stand up and say, treat me fairly. And, research in the psychology literature shows that members of sort of oppressed groups can take on the beliefs of the dominant group and beliefs in their own inferiority. So again, how do we think outside the box and handle groups that maybe for one reason or another can't handle them, can't represent themselves, or even it just hasn't occurred to other people to try to include these groups. So for example, none of the papers on algorithmic fairness from 15 years ago spoke about non-binary individuals in their examples. All the papers will do that in the future. So one of the beautiful concepts is to give a complexity theoretic answer to this question. So all groups that can be recognized by decision trees of height 6, all groups that can be recognized by circuits of size S. So that's a terrific contribution. It says, let's just kick it over to complexity theory and let complexity theory handle the implicit listing. The problem with this is that the audit complexity, given a predictor, is it, say, calibrated on a given, on this collection of sets C? This is a hard problem. It's as hard as weak agnostic learning for C. So this is an NP hard problem in general. And the algorithm, the general multi-calibration algorithm, requires repeated auditing with respect to C. So if C is very large and unstructured, this is not really feasible. So we love it for the fact that we don't need to list groups implicitly, but there's a huge hurdle to overcome. So this motivates what we call the scaffolding set problem, which is to efficiently find a modest-sized collection of sets, S, so that multi-calibration with respect to S actually yields a good approximation of nature, of the thing that we're trying to capture, P star. Why is this good? Because P star is calibrated by definition on all large subsets. So I'm going to call that pan calibration. And recently we found that actually in a not insanely narrow collection of cases, we can definitely do this. So the philosophy then would be the following. Use neural nets to find a potential scaffolding set collection S, or any other method. We are looking at using neural nets, as I'll describe on the next slide. Now, this, again, it's supposed to be a collection of sets S, so that if we multi-calibrate with respect to S, then we will have a good approximation to nature's predictions P star. Again, we don't even know whether nature gives non-integer predictions. It will be impossible to know whether or not we have succeeded. Nonetheless, we can, armed with the collection S, we can proceed, and we can multi-calibrate now with respect to the union of C and S, which will include calibration with respect to S. And it's, so if we have succeeded, then we'll get something that's very close to P star. And there are several different implementation options for this. In particular, if C is such that the HKRR algorithm can be run efficiently, the entire process is efficient. So what do we get? I said we don't know whether we've succeeded or not. We don't know whether this collection S is indeed a scaffolding set collection. If we have succeeded, no matter what we do in step 2, we will have pan calibration. On the other hand, if this collection S isn't really doing for us what we want, and you go ahead and you calibrate with respect to C union S, no harm is done. You're still multi-calibrated with respect to C, which is what you wanted to do. So this is something that can only help, and it's not computationally very expensive. So our starting point is the folklore that the intermediate layers in a neural net provide a high quality representation of the data. And so we can think of a representation mapping that takes inputs, which are also representations themselves of something in the real world, and maybe squeezes it down to some kind of low dimensional representation. And an informal statement of our result says that if nature can be well approximated by a low dimensional mapping composed with a low Lipschitz suffix, then given any approximation of the mapping, we can solve the scaffolding set problem for P star. And the quality of our approximation to P star depends directly on the quality of the approximation H hat. And examples in which we can do this with great success include general linear models and single index models. So we note that learning H hat can actually be a lot easier than directly learning P star. So examples are K-layer neural nets that start by collapsing everything to a scalar, as in the 2 classes of models I've just described. And H hat can then be found by ordinary least squares minimization with only a linear model when the data are drawn from a suitable distribution. Another thing that helps us is that training data for H hat may be abundant. So examples of this will be in transfer learning settings, where we have for different distributions, both covariate shift and concept shift, you would have the same prefix with a different final layer. So maybe you don't have very, very many samples for any given distribution, but lots of samples for training H hat when aggregated over different distributions. So in summary, the talk covered the landscape for algorithmic fairness. We talked about risk prediction and the defining problem of AI, like what is it these algorithms ought to be producing. We suggest outcome indistinguishability as a framework for talking about individual probabilities. And we talked about how to get calibration for sets that we don't know yet how to name via scaffolding sets. 2 important open directions. First is a lot of the literature will talk about how you have to work with the data that you're given. And I don't think this is reasonable. I think that there should be some sort of way of testing to say, are you kidding? Given this kind of representation of individuals, it's impossible to create a fair classifier, a fair scoring function, a fair predictor. you have features that say very different things about according to which group somebody is in. They have different meanings and interpretations in different groups. So how do you interrogate the data and know when to say no? And the second question is what we call Q-star. So we have, as I've said, all of the calibration work is not aspirational. It's all describing the real world P-star, which is not necessarily a very nice world. And the question is, when can we try to actually learn something about or come up with numbers that make sense for a better world in which people have not been repressed and pushed down? And the general idea here is that the real world is some kind of a transformation from the ideal world to the real world. And if we make certain assumptions about that transformation, can we work our way a little bit back towards the ideal world? Okay. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. And perhaps we have questions for the speakers or remarks. Please. So, no questions from the internet? Okay.
Okay.
So, no questions. Okay, so I don't know. I'm thinking just a totally outsider. So what is a typical application of these algorithms?
Great. So these algorithms, in practice, at this point, and this is of course very new technology, but in the notions of multi-calibration have already been very useful in medicine. So, for example, early in the pandemic, there was training data from China, which had had the first collection of cases. And in Israel, the health providers had a lot of detailed information about Israelis, and they had good predictors for predicting information that has to do with trouble breathing, I guess, and respiratory problems. And so they were able to recalibrate their predictors by using statistics from the Chinese data and looking at different age and sex demographic groups and calibrating using this kind of multi-calibration. And they built a new predictor that would predict who was going to be at severe risk for COVID, bad outcomes in Israel. And they were highly successful at this. They did much better than they would have done without these procedures. So this is one example. There was another example with the same group, Khalid, and researchers from the Weizmann, including Guy Rothblum and Galiona, where they were using these things for osteoporosis conditions, and I forget one other condition. Other cases where some of these have been used is to address, say, the problem in the gender shades example, where algorithms for predicting or guessing gender were very inaccurate on Black women and much more successful on white men. And by using these techniques, it was possible to improve the situation considerably. But of course, you could imagine using it for these really serious situations, like determining many states in the United States are already using algorithms to predict whether one is going to commit a violent offense if let out of jail. And so this would be a situation in which you would definitely want multi-calibration. It's used in loans and so on. So in a lot of real life situations.
Thank you. Thank you. It seems very important also to our information and to our democracy somehow. Okay, are there more questions? Okay, so if not, let us thank Cynthia Dwork again for this lecture. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, now we can go to the coffee break. Just one announcement, since someone was asking us, that tomorrow the light lunch is not going on as it was in the previous program into the Via Beato Pellegrino building, but will be instead into Department of Mathematics Torre Archimede. Okay, so there is this change of program. This for the light lunch of tomorrow. Thank you.
Ricordo a tutti il corretto uso della mascherina, per cortesia. Grazie.
Okay, welcome to this last part of the session of the conference of today, and I'm really pleased to announce this roundtable on the mathematical challenge in an AI-driven world. But before starting, let me call Alessandro Sperduti to give 2 words to you.
So on behalf of the rettrice Daniela Mappelli, I give you my warmest regards to you and welcome. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. I would say that for me, that I'm a computer scientist working in artificial intelligence, is an event to have all of you here. And so I think everyone knows how many strong contributions you have given to the field, to modeling of perceptual functions of humans and learning capabilities. And I would say we have here in this room a piece of history of artificial intelligence. So I don't want to cause any delay in starting of this round table. So please enjoy this moment. Thank you very much.
Okay, now I just give the word to the chair of this roundtable, Ernesto De Vito, who is the coordinator of the UMI group on artificial intelligence and machine learning. Thank you very much, De Vito, for being here and to co-organizing this roundtable.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to this roundtable. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer, in particular Fabio Ancona, Pier Marco Cannarsa, and Roberto Nataligi, which made possible to have here three leading experts in machine learning and artificial intelligence: Pier Baldi, Ian LeCun, and Tommaso Poggio. Pier Baldi is the director of the Institute of Genomics and Bioinformatics at the University of California, Irvine. His main research concerns artificial intelligence and machine learning, genetics, and protein secondary structure. His research is multidisciplinary, leaning on both algorithm and dataset. He has contributed significantly to the study of the mathematical foundation of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning, and their application to problems in physics, chemistry, and biology. Ian LeCun is Vice President, Chief AI Scientist at Facebook, Meta, and Silver Professor at New York University. His interests mainly focus on artificial intelligence, pattern recognition, deep learning, computer vision. Many of his studies involve connection with topics such as speech recognition and artificial intelligence. He is one of the founding fathers of convolutional neural network and is known for his work on optical character recognition, the creation of déjà vu technology, and the development of the Lush programming language. In 2018, he was awarded of the Turing Award together with Joshua Basham and Jeffrey Hinton for their work on deep learning. Tommaso Poggio is director of the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Its interest mainly focuses on artificial intelligence, computer vision, cognitive neuroscience, pattern recognition, and neuroscience. He is considered one of the founders of computational neuroscience, author of pioneering models for human and animal vision systems, and he has contributed substantially to the development of regularization theory in the field of computational vision and machine learning. In 2018, he was awarded of the Schwartz Prize for Theoretical and Computational Neuroscience. I regret to inform you that the first speaker, Gita Coutinho, had to cancel her participation because she had an accident on Sunday going on the mountain, and she is unable to be here with us. On behalf of the organizer, I would like to take this opportunity to convey to her our best wishes for her recovery. Let me now briefly describe the structure of the roundtable. There will be a few sets of questions focusing on the mutual interaction between machine learning and mathematics, followed by a discussion open to question and comment coming from the audience. I would like to kindly suggest to the speaker to answer each question about 10 minutes. The first point is the role of mathematics to understand deep learning and more general artificial intelligence. Quoting Tommaso Poggio, deep learning is like electricity after Volta discovered the battery, but before Maxwell. On the other hand, partial differential equations are at the root of theory of electromagnetism. On the same flavor, in 1932, the book Mathematical Foundation of Quantum Mechanics by von Neumann made rigorous the theory of quantum mechanics, formalized in 1930 by Paul Dirac in the book Principles of Quantum Mechanics. And at the same time, the book of von Neumann led to the foundation of spectral calculus, which plays a central role in modern mathematics. I am asking to the speaker, what is the role of mathematics to provide a solid background to deep learning? Do you expect that there will be the need for new mathematical theories? Is deep learning so difficult that we have to look for a new von Neumann possible among the young researchers in the audience? Operator theory and functional analysis were the main tools for mathematical understanding quantum mechanics. What are the main mathematical tools for deep learning? Please.
I think that we can go. Okay, so let me start. Yeah. I think, you know, the story of Volta and the Pila, the battery, is kind of interesting. Volta was in Pisa, which is a much younger university than Padova. It's only, I think, 600 years old or so. And in the year 1800, he invented a little bit by chance the battery. It was the first time there was a continuous source of electricity available to scientists to study it. And so after Volta, in the 20 years after that, there was a lot of applications of electricity, from the electrical generator to electrical motors, to the telegraph that he himself designed, to electrochemistry and so on. But it was not until Maxwell that there was a theory of electromagnetism, and that really opened up all the immense potential of electricity, including radio and television and computers and the internet and deep learning. So you don't need a theory to have very interesting applications, but a theory can help having a second revolutions if you want. And if something like a theory for deep learning where we really understand everything, then this may happen, and we need it, because deep learning in the meantime is used for a lot of application, like including control and detections and all kinds of things which are important in our life, and sometimes it's scary that we don't understand why it works, and by implication, we don't really know when it will not work and when it may crash and give mistakes. This is true, for instance, for autonomous driving, from Tesla to other systems that use deep learning. So not knowing why they may fail, not exactly, it's not very reassuring. Of course, progress in the mathematics of deep learning may give us also the possibility to go beyond the deep learning, finding its limitation and maybe how to extend it in directions that will capture more of what we call human intelligence.
Right. I think it's kind of a vast problem. So if you look at going back to the history of physics also, or the interaction between engineering, physics, and mathematics. The steam engine was invented in the 1700s, but it's not until the 1800s that thermodynamics was put together as kind of a way to explain the limitations and power of steam engine and heat engines in general, and then became the foundation of much of physics and chemistry and biology. And then also motivated mathematicians to develop new methods in things like variational calculus, for example. So I think all of those domains interact with each other in sort of a virtuous circle, but it's very often the case that the artifact appears before the theory that explains its limitation and its power. And I think we're looking at the same thing here in AI and machine learning in particular, where we have an artifact for which we don't have a huge amount of theory. The mathematics on which this artifact is based is extremely simple. The first piece of mathematics is chain rule, which is really trivial. And the second one is stochastic gradient optimization, which is also relatively trivial, although the math for it is not. So those two things are very simple mathematically. But then the practice of deep learning, for example, breaks a lot of the theory that was developed in the context of statistics. So in statistics, we learned that if we have a model and we fit a model to data, and we have more parameters than we have data points, the system will overfit. And in machine learning, we were teaching that to all of our students for many decades. It turns out with deep learning, this truth that you find in every textbook is false. And people had a very hard time accepting this fact. And in fact, it's probably one reason why deep learning didn't take off earlier than it did, because the techniques existed. But there was sort of a bit of a mental block due to the fact that it could not possibly work according to everything we knew about statistics. How is it that we can train an absolutely gigantic neural net with billions or hundreds of billions of parameters with a lot of data, but not that much data, and it will still work pretty well and extrapolate to new samples, whereas it's in a regime where although statistics tells us it should not work. You have many more parameters than you have data points. It's nonlinear, it's non-convex. Why is it that optimization of large neural nets works every time, even though the objective function we know is very, very highly non-convex? This has to do probably with the structure of lost surfaces in high-dimensional spaces, for which few of us have good intuitions, if any. And so there was also the second mental block that theoreticians were telling us. They were telling us, do not use non-convex loss functions because there is no guarantee that you're going to find a good minimum. But we knew experimentally that neural nets worked and that the loss functions were non-convex. And so how do you reconcile the two? So some people would be hypnotized by the theory, not realizing that it's probably a hypothesis behind the theory that is not verified by the experimental aspect. And then people who just see the experimental data and you cannot ignore it. But it was dismissed for about 15 years. So again, how do we understand the complex structure of loss functions that neural nets seem to be able to minimize when we optimize those loss functions pretty well? There's a lot of completely unknown phenomena behind this. There's a little bit of work along those directions that uses either random matrix theory from the mathematics side, or methods that were developed by physicists in the context of condensed matter, spin glasses, and things like this. So there's a lot of interesting work in this area to help us understand really what goes on. But I don't think the answer is full. And then the future of AI is even worse because, in my opinion, this is a very personal opinion that perhaps not few people share, but what I think is the type of learning that we've been using so far, which means supervised learning and reinforcement learning, is not the type of learning that we observe in animals and humans. So animals and humans use another type of learning. I've called it self-supervised learning, but you can give it the name you want, which basically consists in observing the world and understanding how the world works by observation, perhaps by training yourself to predict what's going to happen or predict whatever information is currently missing. Now, here is the problem. If you want to train a system to, let's say, predict video, right? So you show it a segment of a video and you ask the learning system, predict what's going to happen next in the video. You could imagine that the system, by training itself to do this, will understand that the world is three-dimensional, that there are objects that can move independently, that objects that are not supported fall, subject to gravity. And these are all concepts that babies learn in the first few months of life that probably, forms the basis of what we call common sense. But the problem, the mathematical problem behind this is that we do not know how to parameterize this kind of problem or formulate this kind of problem. The traditional way to formulate this kind of problem in machine learning would be through a probabilistic generative model. Okay, I observe X, the beginning of the video, and I need to predict Y, the continuation of that video. And of course, there is no single correct Y, so I'm going to have to model a probability distribution over Y. So we know how to parameterize probability distributions over discrete variables like words in the text or something like that. We have no idea how to parameterize a proper probability distribution over the sets of all video frames, for example, or short video clips. It's a very high-dimensional continuous space. We don't know how to parameterize that. The only way we know how to parameterize that is by writing some sort of energy function and then turning it into a probability distribution by doing e to the minus the energy and normalizing. The problem is that the normalization constant is almost always intractable. So the normal thing that people have done in statistics for decades is how to approximate this normalization constant or its gradient using variational approximation, using Monte Carlo methods, etc. I think what's required is to abandon the idea that we need to model the distribution and even abandon the idea that we need to predict. What we need is to find a way to basically parameterize a machine to tell us when we present it with an X and a Y, it's going to tell us whether this Y is compatible with that X. And that compatibility function doesn't need to be a distribution or anything like that. I call this energy-based models. Call it what you want. But we're outside of the usual framework of probabilistic modeling, and so I think that requires new mathematics, frankly.
I disagree a bit.
I'm not surprised.
I'm going to try to both agree and disagree with some of the things that have been said. I am I'm a mathematician by training, so I certainly love mathematics, and I do think that we need mathematical theories for AI in the long term, and it's a very difficult problem because we cannot define what intelligence is or what consciousness is, really. But in the shorter term, I disagree with the view that we don't understand anything about deep learning and we don't have a mathematical theory of deep learning. We actually think, I think we have a lot of the theory for deep learning is in place. But first of all, we have fairly complete theories of shallow learning, linear regression, logistic regression, etc. And then when you move to deep learning, which means having hidden layers, we know about universal approximation properties. We have fairly complete theories of autoencoders, which essentially cover everything because it's just, saying that the output has to be equal to the input is just a reduction in the number of degrees of freedoms. Jan mentioned the problem of over-parameterized models. So it is true that for the last 2 or 3 centuries, we have been told that a model should not have more parameters than the number of data points. That sort of dogma comes entirely from shallow learning. It comes from linear regression, from Gauss and Legendre in the late 1700s. And then it's true for logistic regression. It's true if you're trying to fit a polynomial of one variable to data. That dogma is certainly true. But as soon as you move to deep learning, where you can see immediately it's completely wrong. And so you can have highly over-parameterized models that do not overfit and can be trained from a small amount of data. And the deep reason behind that is beginning to be understood is that when you have highly over-parameterized models, the space of parameters is partitioned into equivalence classes, where within one equivalent classes, all the models essentially are computing the same function up to some epsilon. So you can think of training of machine learning or training a neural network as a communication process where you're communicating information from the data to the synapses of the network. And the question is, how much information do you need to send from the data to the synapses for the network to do the right things? And so when you have this partitioning into equivalence classes, what you need to, the information you need to send from the data to the synapses is not the specification of individual architectures, individual sets of weights. What you have to specify is the equivalence class, which requires a much smaller number of bits. So I do think that we're beginning to have a fairly good mathematical understanding of over-parameterization. Now, of course, there are still, open problems within deep learning. I don't want to give the wrong impression that everything is solved, but I think there is quite a bit of theory already, and I am not sure that in the short term, the main questions that are facing AI are mathematical in nature. My impression is that we have the main problem in the short term are more problems of structure, of algorithms, of modeling, and so on and so forth. But longer term, definitely we have no mathematical theory of intelligence, of intelligence in different formats, in the digital computers, in physical neural systems.
possibly when we will have quantum computers, there will be also an expansion of these questions. Tommy?
No, I wanted to, this is a question for all of us and the audience also. I think we have a very good linear example where you can have over-parameterization and good behavior in terms of expected error. And this is the pseudo-inverse. You have a linear system that has more parameters than data, and you can solve it. There is an infinite number of solutions. And so you fit the data exactly, you interpolate. But then if you choose the solution among the infinite number which has the minimum L2 norm, that one turns out minimizes the expected error. So this is a case where you have over-parameterization, you fit the data, and you predict well. And gradient descent and stochastic gradient descent will automatically, with appropriate initial condition, converge on the minimum norm solution, not other minimization techniques, but those will. So I personally think that for deep network, the situation is quite similar. There are some recent results by Yaim Cooper about the loss landscape, which tells you that the over-parameterized case, you have a lot of degenerate minima that will correspond to it's like the pseudo-inverse, overfitting and fitting the data. And then the conjecture is that gradient descent will find the minimum. In this case, there is not a single norm, but we found that the product of the Frobenius norms of all the weight matrices replaces the norm for the pseudo-inverse, and minimizing this minimizes a bound on the expected error. And furthermore, we have recent results showing that these bounds are not vacuous. So in fact, you have enough data for controlling the complexity of the regressor. I'm not saying this solves all the problems that Pierre said, but I think it solves one of the mysteries, which is this one of over-parameterization, but still good generalization. There is one confusing factor there, and it is that under certain conditions, you converge to a solution that is not very interesting, is the NTK regime, the neural tangent kernel regime, which corresponds really to finding a kernel. And roughly speaking, is like all the weights are random, remain random, don't change very much, and you only change the ones at the last layer. That's simplifying a lot. But in this case, you find solutions that are not the best ones, but are not bad. They're like kernel solutions. And this solution can have a large norm. So you have to distinguish experimentally between all of these things. So,
well, I mean, I agree, of course. It's one of the things that we learned from the work of our friend Vladimir Vapnik, which is, in kernel methods, the basic idea of kernel methods is that you make the problem over-parameterized. You give essentially a single parameter for every training sample in your training set. And with an appropriate kernel function, you can basically approximate any function you want on your training set. So that's the basic idea of kernel methods. And then you regularize this further, and you get things like supervector machines and things like that, which are highly regularized lookup tables, essentially, right? So you can think of kernel methods as essentially glorified interpolating lookup tables where every training sample has its own little center, if you want, and the output of the function that you're trying to approximate is formulated in terms of interpolation, between those samples using the kernel function. So that's an example of over-parameterizing the problem and then getting a good solution by regularizing. And so basically the new wave of neural nets that appeared, about 10 years ago, or a little more than 10 years ago, basically embraced that notion without explicitly saying it, which is that we're going to ignore the statisticians, and we're going to do like kernel methods, train very large neural nets with whatever data we have, and not worry about the fact that they are overparameterized. But then there is still a mystery, which is that there seems to be some sort of, it's not a mystery anymore, completely, I agree, which is that there seems to be some sort of implicit automatic regularization that takes place when you do gradient-based optimization. And we thought originally it's due to stochastic gradient. It probably is not. It's due to something else. There's the fact that the solution space is very highly degenerate. So a hypothesis I've had, I'm not sure it can be proved mathematically, but it's the fact that if you have a given machine learning problem with a given amount of samples, let's say, and you train a deep learning system with increasing size, what you're doing is that you're increasing the dimension of the degenerate solution. But the number of dimensions that matter in the parameter space does not increase. That's determined by the complexity of the problem, not by the architecture. As you increase the size of architecture, you basically increase the degeneracy of the solution space. And it becomes easier to find because now your optimization problem doesn't need to search for a good dimension in which to find a dimension nearly as hard as normally. If you have a neural net that's just the right size, your optimization algorithm is going to have a very, very hard time finding a good solution because the dimension of that degenerate solution is very small. But if you increase the size of your network, now it becomes really easy to find that solution. It basically is the biggest part of the space. Those intuitions were born out of experimentation, basically, right? There's no theory that told us that beforehand. In fact, most of the theory kind of, told us wrongly that this wasn't the case, but it is. So, and we still, I still don't understand completely the sort of geometric properties of those loss functions.
Well, actually, I think there is some understanding of that, and it's all about these equivalence classes in parameter space.
I agree.
Okay, but for example, what I am come in non-parametric statistics, there is the so-called free lunch theorem that tell you that does not exist an algorithm whose rate is uniform for any problem. Deep learning appear to be in contradiction with this result. There is no a priori assumption. Take a neural network, works very well for any problem. So why to solve this contradiction? Apparently.
Right, those no free lunch theorem tell you that for any machine learning, so any learning machine, if you wanted to be able to learn a problem with a non-exponential number of training samples, will have to be specialized. So it will be able to learn the function with a non-exponential number of training samples only for a very small class of functions. And then for most of the other functions, it's not going to be able to learn it efficiently. May be able to learn it, but it will require a lot of examples. So that's the problem of bias, classical statistical bias. Interestingly, that also suggests that there is no universal intelligence. There is no such thing as general intelligence. Every intelligence needs to be specialized for the same reason, okay? So even human intelligence is very specialized. We'd like to think of ourselves as having general intelligence, but we don't. We are incredibly specialized. And I have a very simple mathematical argument for this, which doesn't play very well with neuroscientists or computer scientists, but I hope for mathematicians it'll work better. So imagine, our optical nerve has roughly 1 million fibers, and let's imagine that this 1 million fibers of the optical nerve are binary, right? So they only carry 1 bit of information. Okay, so we have 2 to the 1 million possible configurations of inputs coming from one of our eyes, right? Now, if we imagine a truth table from 2 to the 1 million possible configurations to 1 bit, one elementary binary function, and we ask the question, how many of those functions exist? Is 2 to the 1 million, which is an unimaginably large number, right? Now, among those 2 to the 1 million functions, how many of them are implementable by our visual cortex? And the answer is an absolutely tiny sliver of them. The reason being that our entire brain only has 2 to the 14th synapses. And so the number of functions that it can represent, even if you count 8 bits per synapse or something like this, is actually tiny compared to the number of possible binary functions that our visual cortex could be asked to solve. So the ones that we are able to solve are a tiny, tiny subset, but it's like, it's like kind of random bit strings. Almost all bit strings are random, except for all the ones we know about. It's the same for intelligence. All the problems are impossible to solve, require much more intelligence than we have, except for all the ones that we can actually solve.
Well, okay, just a couple of remarks. I agree with Jan that, in a sense, humans don't implement general intelligence, but there is still a huge gap between, a machine that plays Go and what humans can do. So there is different level of generality in intelligence, and we're very far from having anything that come close, not only to a human, but just, any mammals or any, any mammal. But Jan made me think of another thing when he was doing those calculations. There is a calculation that is being done all the time. Jeff Hinton is very fond of the following calculation, which is completely wrong. It's to say that the brain has whatever, 10 to the 14, 10 to the 15 synapses, and we live only about 3 billion seconds. So 1 example per second, that's 3 billion examples. And so there is no way that we receive enough examples for training our synapses. And so that's the argument that a model should have the same number of parameters or shouldn't have more parameters than the number of examples. But again, this is it's a deep learning situation with a lot of hidden layers. So the number of you cannot make any conclusion from the fact that we receive way less examples than the number of synapses we have. You could conclude that maybe most of our synapses are not being trained, for example, but that would be a completely wrong conclusion, because a deep system can be over-parameterized. So you just cannot tell anything from those numbers.
I think it would be interesting to look at machine learning from the 3 point of views that are key. One is approximation theory, one is generalization machine learning, and the third is optimization. So the one that is typically neglected is approximation, is the power of a neural network, a deep network, to represent what and which kind of functions. It turns out that if you look at it from this point of view, both shallow and deep network can approximate a very continuous function on a compact domain, but they suffer from the curse of dimensionality, which means it's a question of rate of convergence, which means that the number of parameters, it's an upper bound, but the number of parameters you typically need for learning, for approximating a continuous function with smoothness D, say S, a dimensionality D, with an error, say in the subnorm epsilon, is epsilon to the minus D over S. So if you say, I want to have epsilon 10% error, and you have 10 dimensions, you may need up to 10 to the 10 parameters. If instead of 10, you have 1 million fibers, like you were saying, then is 10 to 1 million, which is a rather big number. So how do you avoid that? Well, it turns out that shallow networks cannot avoid that. Deep networks can avoid this if the function that they are trying to approximate, so that the target function, is compositional in a certain way, hierarchical. So it's basically a sparse function. It's a function of function. Think about one example, the simplest one is a binary tree, where each node of the binary tree is a function of 2 variables. Okay, you can build in this way a function of as many variables as you want. The output has one output, one number. Each function is, this is a composition of functions, where the constituent functions have all 2 dimensions. Now, in terms of the curse of dimensionality, this goes back to Kolmogorov and before, this curse of dimensionality, exponential dependence on dimensions, that in this case, for this compositional function, 2 is the upper limit. So you don't really care about the dimensionality of the overall function, which may be huge. And 2 in this case is like what is called the kernel in a convolutional network. I don't think it's an accident that convolutional network, that by the way, he invented some time ago, right? When was it?
1988.
Yeah, so it's why the big success stories, apart from more recent transformers, were really convolutional networks, not dense networks, because they can avoid the curse of dimensionality. Of course, the interesting, philosophically, very interesting part of this story is that this is an hypothesis about the world, about which target functions are important for us. It says they are compositional in a certain sense, right? And that's something to be studied. And the conjecture I have is that compositional functions are also easy to optimize. And I don't want to take time now, but they're easy to optimize. And the machine learning part, why you generalize, I think that surprisingly is the simple one in all this. So the open problems are more on the optimization side and trying to prove that if you have a sparse function, you can optimize it more easily. Maybe using tricks like attention in the case of transformers, or in the case of convolution network, essentially you are assuming a certain structure that turns out to be correct. And it's reasonable for images, for text, not necessarily for other problems.
Okay. Other comments on this point?
Well, I want to agree with what Pierre was saying, which actually kind of, I mean, I agree with you, what you just said, but on the fact that, you know, what type of, like how are we going to take the next step in AI and machine learning? What do we need to change something about the way we understand learning to be able to build machines that can learn to drive a car in about 20 hours, which any teenager can do, right? So teenagers can learn to drive in about 20-hour practice, with for most of them without causing any accident during that time. Whereas we still don't have level 5 completely autonomous cars. Machines can, you know, beat any human at Go and chess and a number of other games, but those are very sort of narrow fields. So how is it that humans can, you know, essentially learn how the world works, mostly by observation with a bit of interaction, but seemingly with considerably fewer explicit type of, you know, supervised or reinforcement learning cycles than current machine learning systems require. And it's probably because there is another type of learning at play that takes place, you know, in the early days and months of life, in which a lot of knowledge about the world is being built, so that after that, when we need to learn a new skill, we can rely on this background knowledge to not start from zero. And, you know, by the time we learn to drive a car, we already understand all of intuitive physics and everything. So we don't have, if we drive near a cliff, we don't actually have to drive the car off the cliff to realize that something bad is going to result from that. Whereas a blank slate machine learning system, even with a lot of hardwired prior knowledge in it, will basically have to drive off the cliff a few thousand times before it figures out it's a bad idea, and then a few other thousand times before it figures out how to avoid it. And then it's not even clear it's going to be able to avoid this, you know, with enough reliability that we're going to let the car drive itself with people in it. So there is this question, what is the paradigm of learning that humans and animals seem to be learning that seem to make them so much more efficient to kind of learn a task afterwards. Again, I've called this self-supervised learning. I have the hypothesis, and it's certainly being verified in the context of natural language processing, that you can learn the structure of data by basically training a machine to fill in the blanks. So the most successful approach to building a natural language understanding or a translation system today is you take a piece of text, you remove 10% or 15% of the words by masking them with a blank marker, and then you show that piece of text, partially masked text to a very large neural net, and you train it to fill in the blanks, okay? And it's going to produce a probability distribution for every word that is missing as to which word in the dictionary could be filling in the blanks. In the process of doing so, the machine learns a good representation of text that contains everything there is to contain about syntax and semantics and everything like this. This is knowledge that is not related to an experience of the real world, so the understanding of the world that those systems end up having is very superficial, which is why we don't yet have human-level AI with those large systems. But it's surprisingly efficient as a pre-training phase before we train the system for a particular task. The same type of idea has been attempted for image recognition, this idea of filling in the blanks too, and it doesn't really work. There are other techniques that work, but not always to the same extent that techniques that are used for text work. So that's kind of the next challenge. Can we come up with a general self-supervised learning method that will work for things like video and images and will cause machines to learn representation of the data of the world and also predict things like predicting the future in video and things like that?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know, from you and all of you, if we think about the next big step in machine learning, do you think this will come from engineering, from neuroscience, or from mathematics?
All of the above.
Okay.
Me too.
From other things.
From?
From other disciplines.
Physics.
Physics, biology. So I think we're getting to a very interesting question, is how do we push AI to the next level? And there is a number of big branches that one has to consider. One, of course, is to try to look at biology. I think we all think that there is an inspiration there. But even when you look at biology, there is a question of, the brain has so many details, some of them not being relevant. What are really the key ingredients that you want to take inspiration beyond what we already have in deep learning? And so Jan is thinking about the learning algorithms, and that's certainly an important direction. I'd like to mention another one, which is really has to do with storage, with memory. Intelligent system must store information and must process information. We sort of have a feeling that we understand how the brain processes things in the sense of sending a wave of tiny electrical signals to the next layers, etc. But when you start thinking about storage in the brain, we really have no understanding whatsoever. If you ask yourself, where do you store your name or your telephone number in your brain? Nobody can tell you. And even the most fundamental experiment you would like to do, which is take a single bit, let's take a rat, run it in a maze, turn left, turn right. That single bit, you would like to see how it gets stored in the brain of the rat. Of course, that experiment cannot be done today. It's very complicated. Now, of course, there is theory of how storage happens. You will hear stories like, you get information during the day, it gets stored in cortex, in the hippocampus, and during the night you rehearse it, and the hippocampus consolidates the connection in the cortex and creates new connection and establishes connection between the new item that you have learned and the other things you had already in the brain that should be connected to it. But this is a little bit of a fairy tale. It's not a detailed model of storage, and it's certainly very different from what we have in digital computers. So we also should not forget that when we do deep learning, there are no neurons and no synapses. We have a fantasy, a virtualization of neurons and synapses. And this sometimes has got us in trouble. For instance, people have tried to learn the weights of a convolutional neural network using HEB. You can prove mathematically that this is impossible once you start thinking about a physical neural system as opposed as a fantasy of a neural system, which is what you have in Keras, TensorFlow, PyTorch, etc. There are no neurons and no synapses in those systems. Right, Jan?
Well, I think there was a conceptual question that we might ask ourselves, which is that every learning method, or at least all the ones that are reasonable that people have come up with, are basically all some sort of optimization of some sort of objective function, right? So all the ones that have, that kind of work, right? They can be all formulated as the optimization of some objective function. And that's true whether it's supervised reinforcement or self-supervised, unsupervised, whatever. Almost all the ones that are efficient use some estimate of the gradient of that objective to do the update of the parameters. So that's obviously true of deep learning, like supervised deep learning, and backpropagation is a gradient estimation procedure, basically. So we can ask the question, does the brain minimize an objective function? First question. Second question, if it does it do it by estimating some sort of gradient information? And how does it do it if it does? So my opinion on this is that the objective function that the brain minimizes may not be explicit. It could be a Lyapunov function that nobody designed it, right? But it may still exist because learning converges. If you want learning to converge, there has to be some sort of Lyapunov function. But then the next question is, I think, more interesting. Is there a way by which the brain estimates the gradient of that objective? And the answer to this, in my opinion, is absolutely yes, because the alternatives are so much less efficient. Zeroth order optimization is much, much, much less efficient than first order optimization that uses the gradient, that there has to be some sort of gradient estimation procedure. But a lot of people are still kind of resisting this idea somehow that the brain uses the gradient descent. I think it has to.
Well, it depends whether it's gradient descent, say, layer-wise or not, because biologically it seems very implausible that you can transmit gradients across so many different layers, like you do in backpropagation. So if you can do it layer-wise, and I think you can, it's less optimal in terms of time and so on with our computers, but in the brain it may be pretty good, but then all the information is local, right? If you have information of the target and you optimize layer-wise, one step at a time, then things may work, and that could be biologically plausible. So that's gradient, but is not.
Right. I mean, it's what some of us call target prop, right? So basically, you're computing a virtual target for every unit in your network, and that can be done with things. In the end, it works exactly the same as gradient-based estimation using backprop, but it's using a different underlying mechanism. Yeah. But I would put this in the category of gradient estimation. I agree. Yeah, I agree with you too.
I disagree, because when you're talking about your layer-wise targets, okay, those targets need to have the information of the true target.
Oh, absolutely.
So there has to, in a physical system, there has to be a channel that convey the information about the deep targets to the local targets.
Yeah, I agree.
But that's okay, biologically.
That's fine.
There are plenty of connections.
Yeah, there's plenty of connections, yeah.
Back projection.
Yeah,
what is not plausible is just transmitting the
And we know now, the big thing we know now is that they don't have to be symmetric in the backward pass due to random backpropagation or feedback alignment, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, so that's a big result, I think, over the last 20 years.
Now, locally, you have something very similar to a perceptron rule for each layer.
Yeah, absolutely. Locally, it looks like a perceptron rule.
Those are easy to.
So to go back to your question about memory, I mean, some of those things we know for a fact that because there have been people without a hippocampus. So if you don't have a hippocampus, you cannot remember things for more than about 20 or 30 seconds. So your life is a succession of 20-second episodes that are completely disconnected with each other. So the cortex certainly does not have the capacity of storing short-term memory. You need a hippocampus for this. So this is very much, in fact, like a computer where you have a kind of a CPU and a RAM and you store stuff in the RAM. It doesn't work the same way at all, of course. Hippocampus is more like an associative memory. But that is the sort of temporary working memory storage that the cortex has to be complemented by to be able to do anything. If you don't have a short-term memory, you can't have long sequences of inferences, and you can't remember how to get out of this building because you don't remember where the door is or the stairs. So I think this model by which we have this model of neural nets that don't have external memory, where a neural net carries information to another part of the neural net using essentially a vector or a multidimensional array of some type. But in fact, what's more likely is that the way information is transmitted from one part of a neural net to another is through an associative memory, perhaps similar to the hippocampus, that gets updated. Like, for example, we're all observing this room right now, okay? And I'm going to push this bottle. The bottle is moved a little bit. Your idea of the state of the world now in your hippocampus is not some giant vector that was produced by your cortex. It's the content of your hippocampus that was just slightly affected by the fact that I pushed this bottle. Now your representation of the current state of this world is slightly modified. Just that bit is modified. So you have a persistent idea of the state of the world, and it gets modified by your perception, but only ever so slightly. That would be, I think, a model of short-term memory that we would require.
Okay, so I have a question from the audience. What area of mathematics do you think needs to be developed to produce guarantee of safety and fairness of AI systems as they become more pervasive?
Sorry, I didn't understand the last word. More?
More pervasive. So, pervasive.
Okay,
I think, okay, so I mean, there is an easy answer to this, which is this idea of self-supervised learning has completely taken over natural language understanding. It's bringing a lot of progress also in speech recognition. I think the next progress is going to be in image recognition and learning from video. When that happens, when we are able to train sort of future AI system to understand how the world works by watching video, essentially, I think we're going to have a new wave of a new generation, if you want, a new breed of AI systems that possibly will have something that has eluded all of AI, from the last 6 decades, which is machines that have some level of common sense, that really have some understanding of the world of the same type that your Husky or your dog has, which current machines still do not have. And I think that will have to come from this type of learning. Now, how long is that going to take? Is that going to be a breakthrough in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? I really don't know. It might be a lot harder than we think. But that's what I'm working on. Whether it will succeed, we'll see.
What's the question about what areas of mathematics are needed? Yes, I think the question was slightly different. I would say most of them. Even today, for some problems you need combinatorics, you need stochastic differential equations, you need algebra, geometry, everything is needed, depending on the problems.
Yeah, I think optimization is probably the one area that needs progress for machine learning. I don't think we need the new mathematics to understand machine learning, but we may need some more results in terms of optimization. That's the part that I find still a little bit unclear. The rest, in terms of generalization and approximation, is relatively clear. There are questions, for instance, like if you are trying to learn a sparse function like I described, it's easy to see that you can learn it with a network that is appropriately sparse, like a convolutional network, if that is the structure, the graph of the underlying function. But suppose you don't know that the graph of the regression function, the target function, then are there a way to learn it starting from a dense network or not? There are some results that seem to say that it's too complicated for optimization for certain cases. So for instance, there is a paper showing that the problem of finding k consecutive bits in same bits in a string is easy to do for a convolutional network, and it's very difficult to do computationally in terms of optimization, not example, but optimization for a dense network. So this seems to say that optimization can have some problems that are very difficult. And one can ask, how can you solve that problem, for instance, in the case of transformers, where you don't have a structure that tells you which variables have to go together. You find them with an attentional step. Which, by the way, brings me to another question that I would love to ask both of you and everybody. What is a good intuitive model of a transformer? Is it a giant associative memory? Which, by the way, associative memory is just an historical remark, because I find it quite interesting. Back in the 60s, people were worrying not about generalization, but about memory. And at the time, holography was quite fashionable. Dennis Gabor at Imperial College got the Nobel Prize for inventing holography. And one of the scheme of holographies is that you store, using laser and at the time photographic plate, you store the convolution of two patterns, X and Y. X is your key. Think of it as a random-like key, one orthogonal function in a sense, and Y is an image. So you store this convolution XY, can do it for many pairs, so you start with the sum of X1, Y1, X2, Y2, and so on. And then when you want to retrieve, say, Y2, you present the laser light that reflects the key X2. And what happens optically is a correlation between the X2 and all the patterns stored. And if the X2 stored is the only one that is, that does not give a zero dot product with X2, all the other ones disappear and Y2 will appear. Okay, that's an associative memory holographically. And in '69, there was a paper in Nature by Longuet Higgins and David Wishaw having a network, which was one of the first neural networks, which was kind of replicating this with binary patterns, storing in units, instead of optically, storing in units the multiplication of the elements of two binary patterns. And they show that you can retrieve a lot of memories, and also in not well-known papers later on, we'll use this recursively. This is like a deep network. with the same weight, finding that you can get better results. And that this difference between an associative memory and learning is very small, because if you present a pattern that is not exactly the key you had, but something close, you want to get something out which is not exactly the why, but something's close to it. So I think you can look at deep networks, including transformers, as associative memories of some form, some very similar. And
I mean, the basic piece of a transformer, the basic piece of circuit that a transformer uses is exactly an associative memory. I mean, it's not like an associative memory, it is an associative memory.
The attentional step, right?
Pardon?
The first attentional step.
What's called the self-attention, or attention in general.
Self-attention.
It's not the self-attention, it's just the attention, right? You feed a key or a query, that query is compared to a bunch of keys.
Yeah, that's
and then
what
they give you scores, and you compute a linear combination of the output value vectors. That's an associative memory. Now there is the self-attention is one in which every query serves also as a key. And so you get this kind of Gram matrix of the dot product of all the keys with each other. And that makes the overall function of a transformer equivariant to permutation. So if you give a bunch of vectors to a transformer, you get a bunch of answers, the same number. Each of those are vectors or multidimensional arrays of some kind. If you permute the input, the output get permuted also, but otherwise unchanged. That is to be compared with convolutional nets, which are equivariant to translation, right? To convolutional net, you translate the input, the output is also translated, but otherwise unchanged. It's the same type of property for a different set of transformations, basically. And I think the combination of the two is really great, because if you have an image, you start with using convolutions and pooling, so you get a representation that is appropriate for images. But then you get to the level where the things that are represented basically are objects. And now you need to do sort of object-based reasoning to figure out, is this object in front of that other, or above or below? And for that, you're better off using a transformer. So my favorite combination is several layers of a convolutional net followed by a few layers of a transformer. At least for detection, that's what works really well. So I didn't answer the first question you asked, which was about new mathematics. So my answer to this would be, and that's the reason I started talking about self-supervised learning, to be able, I think we need a new way to formulate the idea of capturing dependencies between variables that does not rely on probability theory, basically. Because formulating probabilities in distributions, or parametrizing probability distributions in high-dimensional continuous spaces is an intractable problem. And so we need to abandon the idea that we need to model distributions. If we have two variables, x and y, and we know there is some dependency between them, for example, because the set of compatible x and y lies in a low-dimensional manifold, just for an example. The best way to model this is not through a joint distribution of x and y, but through some sort of implicit function that tells us you are on a manifold or you are far away from it, and perhaps something that tells us how far we are from that manifold. And it's non-probabilistic modeling of dependencies. And frankly, I need your help. I don't know how to do this properly. I know how to make it work in practice. I just don't know what the right mathematical formulation for it is.
So I agree with Jan and with Tommy on what they have said about transformers. I'm actually giving a talk tomorrow on transformers and attention in Alessandro Sperduti's class. A small historical note is that another form of associative memory was Hopfield model in 1982, which was a shallow network with no hidden neurons, and Hebbian learning basically for setting up the synapses and building an associative memory. Transformers have this very nice invariance with respect to permutations of the inputs, and that makes them also useful not only for problems in language, but for problems in other areas. For instance, we're using them in physics, where your input data is not a sequence, but is a set of vectors representing, for instance, momenta of particles in a collision. So you can permute those vectors in any order. The order is not important. So transformers are being very useful, being applied in completely different areas in very, very efficient ways.
Okay, thanks. There is another question. In a recent paper, a research team used artificial intelligence system in order to discover patterns in pure mathematics that have never been seen before. What do you think about this aspect and the use of artificial intelligence? So it is the opposite. What is the role of machine learning in mathematics? And there is also, quoting from Meta web page, Facebook AI has built the first AI system that can solve advanced mathematical equations using symbolic reasoning.
Yeah, so there's a group at FAIR led by a young scientist called Guillaume Lample. He and François Charton had a paper a few years ago where they showed that you can generate a lot of formulas and their derivatives, right? So you just use a standard symbolic manipulation system to generate the derivative of a particular function. So you generate millions of them, and then you train one of those transformer neural nets to start from the derivative and to produce the integral. And it turns out this works pretty well, which is kind of amazing. So you can train one of those architectures that's designed for language to essentially integrate symbolically a formula, including some fairly complex ones. And it works, you know, it works in situations where, you know, Mathematica and other tools of that type would fail, which is really interesting. They've done the same thing for first and second order ordinary differential equations, and now they're working on essentially theorem proving. So they have a couple of papers. They're still under review for, you know, basically generating proofs for theorems, and they are the big question. I mean, those things have existed for a long time, but the problem with them is that they don't have kind of an abstract representation of really what an interesting proof is, and so they don't really, you know, they can generate tons of completely uninteresting results by just sort of, you know, symbol manipulation. But the question is, you know, can you give a goal of a conjecture, for example, and can the system kind of figure out the right set of steps that will generate the proof? So that's what they're working on. They're making progress. There's probably going to be publications about this pretty soon. There's been a few already. There's a few groups around the world that are working on this.
There have been a few publications recently on using deep learning, deep reinforcement learning, to prove or disprove certain conjectures in combinatorics, for instance. So I think that's also an area where there is potential. However, we're very far, I think, from having deep learning or AI that can do really new, interesting mathematics or physics.
Tommy?
Yes, you know, the most impressive things I've seen from transformers is the ability to program. So they seem to be as good as an average human programmer. If you give instructions for a program, say roughly of 1 page length or so, that's pretty impressive. There is a paper which is a bit exaggerated in ArcSieve right now, in which a transformer trained on codecs is claimed to solve all the mathematics problem in 3 basic courses at MIT in math 100% correctly. Now, I think that's a bit exaggerated because the questions which are in English had to be asked again in order for the transformer to get the correct answer. So there is a little bit of trial and error there. And the answer are in terms of programs that solve the question. But still, it's quite impressive. And especially if you play with the transformer, you can have a conversation. And although it's easy to find bugs, it's also quite impressive. Up to the point that one could ask, sometimes I ask, if at some point the transformer becomes conscious, how do we realize that? How do we know? I think we're still far from it, but you know, it's one of these questions where we are probably still far because something big is missing, but maybe something small is missing. And that's a very interesting question.
It's a big debate, you know, what are we missing? One of the things might be things like the type of learning that we observe in animals and humans, but maybe some other characteristics. You know, we seem to have, like our entire front half of our brain, prefrontal cortex, is basically our model of the world, right? That's what allows us to predict what's going to happen, either because the world is evolving or as a consequence of our actions. And so if we can predict what's going to happen as a consequence of our actions, we're able to plan. And we're able to plan very complex sequences of actions by decomposing them into you know, simpler subtasks, if you want. We have no idea how to do this with AI systems at the moment, like really no idea. And there's not even been any attempts to do this. You know, that tells you how far we are. I think a lot of this hinges on the fact that we don't have any learning methods at the moment that allows a system to learn abstract representations of the type that animals and humans seem to be able to extract. So, for example, let me take an example in science, but it's another. I'll come down to something simpler afterwards. So, what allowed Newton, for example, to write down the laws of motion and, you know, gravity, is the fact that nothing matters except the mass and initial position and velocity of heavenly bodies. Nothing else matters. Their composition, their shape, rotation, that doesn't matter at all, or very little. What matters only is, you know, mass and velocity and position. And so basically he's kind of figured out sort of an abstract representation of things that matter to be able to predict long-term, to make long-term predictions about positions of objects. Now, we do the same thing all the time. We don't realize it, but we build this kind of theory all the time of the world, right? Let's say we learn to drive. When we learn to drive, there's all kinds of things that happen in the world. You know, things that matter, like what the cars around us are going to do. We need to be able to predict what is likely that the cars around us are going to do to be able to drive safely. It doesn't matter what type of car, what color of car it is. It doesn't matter, you know, there might be trees bordering the road, and those trees, you know, there may be wind, and so the leaves of the trees are moving, and behind the trees there is a pond, and there's ripples on the pond. If we have a predictive model that tries to be a generative model, which means trying to predict everything that happens in the world, in all of these details, we're going to spend a huge amount of resources just predicting this completely useless stuff, which is, you know, the leaves moving and the ripples on the pond. So what we are able to do is learn abstract representations of the world that essentially eliminate all of those details, are invariant to those, you know, irrelevant details, and maintain the useful things that allow us to predict. How to do this, I think, is a big question. I have some ideas about how to do this, but none of this has been shown to really work in a big way. And the only way I found to be able to do this requires to throw away this idea of generative model for the reason I just explained, and requires to throw away probabilistic modeling for reasons that I don't have to explain. So again, that might require new mathematics of the type that I was talking about earlier.
I'm not going to comment on whether transformers are going to be conscious anytime soon, but to go back to your point, there is other areas of interactions, I think, of AI, deep learning, and mathematics, and one of them would be education. That is, you can, I think, even today, you can start building AI system that can help teaching of mathematics, you know, creating problems that are at the right boundary for a given person in a very personalized way, so that they are not too difficult, but they are challenging, etc. So I think that is also an area of synergy between mathematics and AI. And on a different note, something that has not been mentioned today, but there is also the issue of, you know, using symbolic approaches in combination with deep learning to build more intelligent systems. And that is also an open area. Some people think it's completely you know, the wrong direction, that all the symbolic stuff can be implemented with deep learning, and that's fine. But even in that case, it could be that in a transition phase, for some problems, it is a good idea to look for you know, mixed solutions, combining logic and you know, other rule-based systems with deep learning.
My problem with this is that symbolic manipulation and things like classical logic is essentially incompatible with gradient-based learning because it's very non-differentiable. Right? It's all kind of discrete things, and so I think a lot of reasoning that humans and animals do has nothing to do with logic. It has to do with simulation and perhaps constraint satisfaction, things like this. A lot of what we call logic can be reduced to this actually, but the big question is how do you build something that has the capabilities that we would assume require symbol manipulation, but in ways that are essentially differentiable and compatible with deep learning? That's the question.
But there are problems in different classes, like predicting chemical reactions, or special areas of knowledge where maybe there is something to be done by combining deep learning and symbolic methods.
There is another question. How much the algorithms of deep learning work because they possibly hide a reduction of the number of degree of freedom?
Well, I think my conjecture is that that's exactly what happens. So this argument about curse of dimensionality says that target functions that are intrinsically high dimensional cannot be learned. They require too many parameters and probably impossible to learn from the optimization point of view, and they will require too many examples from the point of view of machine learning. So I think that's why convolutional network work. They reduce dimensionality, essentially having compositionality, having constituent functions with low dimensionality. And I think in transformers, the similar reduction happens in the initial stage of the attentional step, choosing a subset of all the tokens to be carried on in successive stages, for instance, be given to the MLP later on. And there are some, so this is from the point of view of approximation, but I think, as I said, the conjecture is the same holds for optimization. There are some recent results about what are called staircase functions. These are Boolean functions where, simple version of it, where you have x1 and x2 and x3, and then you will have x1 times x2, but you will not have an x5 that does not appear as a linear term, and so on. So the interesting part is that if you have such staircase functions, then they are easy to learn, layer-wise and also empirically easy to learn with a multi-layer perceptron. So whereas in a general Boolean function would be essentially impossible to learn computation. So that's an indication that, again, some structure in the underlying target function could help enormously both approximation and also optimization, and make generalization possible. So that's a conjecture, but I'm curious what you would say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ability of what multilayer nets need to be able to do is exploit the sort of low-dimensional structure of data. So almost all of natural data has some sort of low-dimensional structure. If you take pictures of, we take one person, okay, at random here in the room, and we ask that person to step in front of a camera and make faces and talk and pronounce different, different sounds, and we collect all of those images of that person for a very long time, each of which would be, I don't know, 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, right? So we get, let's say it's black and white grayscale, so we get 1 million dimensional vector for each picture that we take of that person. And then we ask the question, what is the manifold on which those, all the images that we have collected lies on? What is intrinsic dimension? And the intrinsic dimension, of course, is bounded above by how many muscles we have in our face, if we ignore like individual hair movement and things like that, right? So it's on the order of 50 or so, less than 100. So the set of all images of a face of a single person lies in a low-dimensional manifold of dimension less than 100. And we take all people on the planet, it's not going to be more than a few thousand for the dimension, even though the ambient space is 1 million. So, you know, it's true of almost all natural data that there is some very strong structure of this type. And the question is how to exploit that structure, how to discover it if it needs to be, or and how to exploit it.
So you agree?
I do.
Okay, there is another question from the audience. Can you give your perspective on neural symbolic integration? Are current neural networks sufficient to perform high-level reasoning?
Yes. Well, I mean, this is what Pierre just talked about, right? Integrating like symbolic reasoning with neural nets. So I think it has to be done in ways that are compatible with deep learning. My hunch is that things like transformer basically do more or less what we need. I think that we need one more element, which would be inference of latent variables, so things like that. But which I think would be more powerful than whatever transformers can already do. But I think they can already do a lot. So I don't believe in sort of explicit kind of hard discrete symbolic manipulation of the type that people were doing in AI in the 1980s. But I do think at some level, intelligent system will have to be able to kind of basically manipulate relations between objects, and that's really what this is about, as long as it can be done in a differentiable way.
Okay. I think that we are more or less at the end of the conference. I would like to thank the speaker, and I think that we have time for 1-2 questions from the audience. Yes, but okay, now give the possibility also to the present to, otherwise I could. Yes.
They have a microphone there.
Thank you very much for being here. It's a great pleasure to have you all three here. And before we talked a lot about the brain, how the brain works, and also about imitating, trying to become more similar to how the brain works. But there are a lot of cases where the machines do better than our brain. There are tasks where classification is way more precise using a deep neural network rather than from a human operator. What do you think about this? There is a trade-off between those things. The errors are just because of human error, and so that we can miss something.
Clearly, neural nets, like when they're used for driving assistance systems, for example, don't make the mistakes of attention that people do, right? So there's this big bug in the design of, or the evolution of the human mind, which is that we basically can only solve one conscious task at a time. We can do a lot of things subconsciously simultaneously. So by the time we are experienced drivers, for example, we can drive a car at the same time that someone talks to us. But if our attention is distracted too much, we start making mistakes on the main task. So we can't fiddle with our phone or radio, while we're driving for too long, because that creates accidents. Many accidents are caused by inattention. So we won't have that problem with AI systems, which is why those automatic emergency braking systems that all the cars come out with right now, they all use convolutional nets, by the way. Most of them come from a company called Mobileye, which now belongs to Intel. But that's why they're so useful. That's why they save lives. So in very narrow domains, AI systems currently can have superhuman performance. We have systems now that can translate, not perfectly, but pretty usefully from hundreds of languages between every pair of languages, even close to 1,000 languages. That's very useful, and it's progress of only the last 2 or 3 years, and it's superhuman. I don't know any human who can translate 1,000 languages from any pair. So we can get superhuman performance in those narrow domains. We still don't have systems that can have the same type of common sense that humans have, and there are. As I said, there's research along those directions, but it's not clear when that will land. This may take decades. We don't know. Now the question is, what happens once we figure this out, and once we have machines that are as intelligent as humans in all the domains in which humans are intelligent. So I would call this human-level intelligence, if you want. And the answer is there is no question that this will happen someday. Maybe not in a too distant future. It's probably harder than we think it is, but there's no question it will happen at some point. Those systems will not have all the characteristics of human intelligence, and they certainly will. People are afraid of the Terminator scenario where we build super intelligent machines and they take over the world. There's no reason for those machines to want to dominate anything. Okay, that's a human trait. It's a trait of social animals, actually, but there's no reason for future AI systems or robots to want to do this unless we hardwire that type of behavior into them, which would be crazy.
We have time for a last short question.
If I may, hi. Okay. In fact, I guess I was the last guy writing a question so let me, continuing this line of thought and speaking about not really an AI having the same intelligence as a human being in all fields, but let's just narrow it down into doing math, because it has been said that it is far the moment where a computer will be able to do math as a human being. But I wonder, how far is that? Are we speaking about 10 years, 50 years? Is a guess in this direction possible at all? Thanks.
In the end, those systems would be tools that would be under the control of humans. So, the same way you can use, Wolfram Alpha or something like this, to compute an integral that you're too lazy to compute yourself, or things of that type. Those are tools, right? So I think those systems will be used as tools, but will still be under human control. They'll sort of amplify your intelligence, right? If I understood your question correctly, which I'm not sure I did.
Yes. Yeah. Sure, there can be tools, but once the tool is smarter than you, for instance, I never do multiplication of 2 big numbers by myself because, I have a calculator and I do that. And the moment I have a calculator to whom I ask, okay, is this theorem true? Or can you formulate the next relevant conjecture? And whatever, at some point, it just does all the job. And which is interesting from some perspective, a little bit scaring from the perspective of a working mathematician as myself.
Well, it's not any scarier than working with a student who is smarter than you.
I disagree with this. I kind of disagree with this because once you have one AI which is better than one mathematician, well then is better in a moment is better than all the mathematicians combined, right? And it doesn't need any further training and whatever, and it's gone, and then you can just read the portion of the mathematics that is done. With the student, there is a little bit. It's more comparable, right? You can be the teacher of Terence Tao, but still, once you spoke to Terence Tao, and maybe he got something, but that.
But the good news is that it's not a competition. The same way we try hard to not put ourselves in competition with our own students. We're not going to be in competition with those systems. We're going to use them, okay? So we're going to collaborate with them. I don't know if we'll have to put their name as co-authors on the paper or just, put in acknowledgement that we use this particular software. But I don't know about you, but, I used to be the director of FAIR, which now means Fundamental AI Research meta-fundamental AI research. And I hired the first 100 scientists or so, and all the people I hired are smarter than me, but I was not in competition with them. My goal was to only hire people who are smarter than me, so that the production of the entire organization was good. So it's not a competition when you are collaborating with something that's smarter than you. And it's the case, for many of us who are in situations of management or decision making, that we're working with people who are smarter than us, and they don't necessarily want to take over our job.
But I never spoke about competition, just to be clear. I mean, never spoke about competition.
So I think that we are more or less at the end of the discussion. So let me thank again the speakers and the audience.
Okay, thank you to all the panelists, really. And just two short announcements again for tomorrow. So the first one I already gave before, but let me repeat that tomorrow there will be at 1 p.m. a light lunch, light because then there is the dinner in the evening, which is supposed to be more consistent. So the light lunch is not in the building of Via Beato Pellegrino as it was written in the booklet that we received. Instead, the light lunch tomorrow will be delivered at Department of Mathematics, Torre Archimede, Via Trieste 63. Okay? The other announcement is quite important, is that in order to go to the social dinner, we have to take a bus. Social dinner is at 7:30 p.m., but in the appointment in order to take a bus is again at Math Department, Torre Archimede, at 7 p.m. And it's important to arrive in time to this. Thank you and have a nice evening. See you tomorrow.